Good morning, Bishop Noll. Today, November 11th, we observe Veterans Day, one that is set aside to honor all of Americans' veterans, living and dead, who served our nation's military in times of war and peace. On this day, all Americans recognize the veterans of the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine, and the Space Force. Here is Mr. Ryan Julian to tell us about the history of this day that began as Armistice Day following the Great War.
On November 11th, Americans will observe Veterans Day to honor our nation's veterans, living and dead who served in our country's military in times of war and in peace. Originally, November 11th was set aside as Armistice Day in the early 1920s to remember the day guns fell silent on the Western Front in France, ending the Great War, or as we know it, World War I. And this was after 4 years of bloody conflict and millions of lives lost. This Wednesday will mark the 102nd anniversary of this solemn and sacred moment when all fighting and shelling stopped on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1918. In the greatest and bloodiest battle of that war, the 47-day-long fight in the Argonne Forest, where artillery shells exploded without end, day and night. Once the ceased fire took effect, America and its allied soldiers remembered that the silence itself was deafening. It was remembered as the silence heard around the world. Many soldiers wept as they realized that the war, this bloody fight, was finally over. In 1921, an American soldier was buried on a Virginian hillside overlooking the Arlington Cemetery with full military honors. He was one of the 4 unknown American soldiers whose bodies were exhumed from 4 cemeteries in France, with some 4,000 of whose remains could not be identified. U.S. Sergeant Edward Younger, a highly decorated and wounded combat veteran, was selected to choose the one casket that would be sent to Washington, and then eventually to Arlington to honor this soldier. While making his decision, Sergeant Younger later recalled, something pulled him to a place of spray of white roses on the 3rd casket from the left. It felt like the hand of God had guided him to that casket. Those remains were then sent to the United States aboard a warship, the USS Olympia. That soldier first lay in the state capitol rotunda, then his final resting place in Arlington. Above that tomb are inscripted the words, "Here rest in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." The remaining 3 soldiers were laid to rest in a place of honor at the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery in modern France. Similar ceremonies took place in England, France, and our allies, where unknown warriors and their nation buried them in places of honor. In England, it was the Westminster Abbey, while the French buried their heroes in the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. No one knew who these soldiers were, where they come from, nor the units in which they served. Today, in Arlington, the remains of the 2 others lie near the soldier from the First World War. One gave his life in World War II, the other in the Korean War. 5 million Americans fought in the Great War, and 116,000 gave their lives in that conflict. Thousands came aboard home disabled, both physically and mentally, in some cities, who the veterans could not find work, often stood in street corners wearing their old uniforms, selling apples as harsh times fell on Americans. There were no Veterans Administration in those days. A generation later, over 16 million American men and women answered the nation's call of duty and saved the world from Hitler's Nazi war machine and the Empire of Japan. Over 400,000 of them perished in Europe and in the Pacific. Thousands of the greatest generation are still with us today, all in their 90s and beyond. 5 years later, President Truman sent the U.S. military to Korea to stop the North Korean invasion of South Korea. In that war, some 6 million Americans served, and nearly 40,000 of them gave their lives fighting the Communist Chinese and the North Koreans. Sadly, a peace treaty was never agreed upon, and the United States is technically still at war with Communist North Korea. Since then, the United States had fought in Vietnam, where over 8 million have served, from 1961 to 1973. The cost was over 58,000 young Americans' lives, and this war divided the nation. Sadly, too many Americans blame the soldiers who fought and who were wounded and died, and not those who had the war continued. Many of those young men who returned were scorned and spit upon by Americans after they had served. Since the Vietnam War, the U.S. military has regained the respect of its nation. The U.S. military has engaged in the first Gulf War in 1991, the War on Terror following the September 11th attacks in 2001, and the Iraq War the following year in 2002. In those conflicts, some 3 million men and women served, and some 8,000 plus made the ultimate sacrifice for their country and their fellow Americans. Those young men and women are greeted as heroes by the fellow countrymen upon their return. Today, there are 22 million veterans in the United States, with the oldest being from World War II, from the youngest in their 20s from the War on Terror. The overwhelming majority returned to become productive citizens, raised families, went to schools, ran successful businesses, ran for public office, and since World War II, 9 of them have become President of the United States. Many of our veterans endured a great deal in combat, where they suffered wounds and lost many of their close friends. They are grateful for making it back home and ask for very little from their country, but they do ask their countrymen just to remember and never forget the comrades that were lost and have never returned home. Always keep in mind, it is the soldier who is the last person who ever wants a war, but it is also the same soldier who is the first to answer our nation's call and lay down his or her life for a nation and for all Americans.
There are some 20 million veterans living today from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the War on Terror. They are men and women from all races, religions, ethnic groups, and every economic class and region of our great nation. In times of major conflicts, they even included actors, sports figures, and singers. Even Hollywood and rock and roll kings served when called. The vast majority of our veterans returned to civilian life and became productive citizens. Most returned to their former jobs in business or industry. Others went on to school on the GI Bill, and most raised families. Since World War II, 9 have become presidents of the United States. They are also our parents, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, teachers, and just people we deal with every day. America's veterans gave some of the best years of their lives in service to our nation, and many endured a great deal of hardship. They ask for little for themselves, but they do request that their comrades who made the ultimate sacrifice never be forgotten. At the burial for the unknown soldier from the Vietnam War in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan reminded the nation that the last person who wants war is the soldier. But it is the men and women of America's armed forces that are the first to answer the nation's call to defend our freedom. Oh yes, go Army.